Hey everybody, Tony Bacigalupo here with Gathering Summit, and my next guest is Casper ter Kuile. He is one of the co-authors of the How We Gather report, which was produced as part of a project with the Harvard Divinity School, and it is one of the reasons that we're doing this conference. Is his report kind of created this ripple effect of awareness of the intersection between issues happening in religious communities around adoption and participation, and all of the kind of secular things that are happening in community building right now. And so he's got an amazing perspective on things. He has a podcast about Harry Potter and the Harry Potter books being treated as sacred texts, which is super fun. And he's just working on some amazing stuff. He's got incredible energy. He's got a really great perspective on what's going on. And so without further ado, let's get into the conversation with Casper ter Kuile. Casper, thank you so much for joining me. I'm so excited to have you along.
I'm so glad to be here, and I'm so glad everyone's here, like, enjoying this day together. It's awesome.
I interviewed you already once recently for Juicy Radio podcast, and I felt like we were just getting started. So this is great that we get to sit down again and kind of, I don't want to say pick up where we left off, but we get to just explore a whole new world of conversation. So
turns out there's more to talk about.
Okay, so let's set the stage, first of all, on the macro. Stuff is going on in the world. People are depressed. There's opioid use. There's extreme stuff going on in politics. In your report, you've mentioned numbers like 3,500 churches are closing every year. 36% of 18 and 24-year-olds describe their religion as nothing in particular. We seem to have a crisis of belonging going on in the world. Is that right? Like, can you tell me kind of what's going on in the world right now?
Well, there's definitely really powerful trends in terms of the traditional kind of bastions of how we've organized ourselves in society breaking down, which is everything from the traditional structure of the family, where, 50 years ago, it would have been normal for the man to go to work and the woman to be at home. Thankfully, we've been liberated from many of those concepts in terms of both what is a family and who works and who earns money. But one of the things that a lot of the kind of institutions of the church or the community institutions that we would have expected to be around, they were run on free labor, frankly. And often it was women who were working for free who were sustaining those communities. And so one of the big trends that sociologists point to of why we're in this situation is in part because of some of those changing work demographics. So that's one piece. The kind of religious piece on its own, one of the big contributors to why a lot of people in our generation are stepping away from traditional religious institutions is some of the nastiness of the 1990s, where you had things like in the Christian construct, the kind of moral majority, focus on the family, a very right-wing, very politicized religion, which meant that if you, if someone said, I'm a Christian, for example, you would immediately assume that they were, anti-gay, anti-women, anti-choice, all of that kind of stuff. So the kind of the brand identity of mainstream religion really had a bad decade in the 90s. And so that's shifted how people want to engage with religion, certainly. But the other one that's just maybe more important than either of those two is that more and more we live in a world of diversity, in the sense that, maybe 200 years ago, if you grew up in a small village somewhere, you would expect to live in that small village for most of your life, to marry someone who was known to your family. You would have continued attending the same religious community through most of your life. And there was a pretty stable, bundled up way of living in terms of where you found community, where you found meaning. But just like the newspaper used to be a bundle of, everything from news to sports news to quizzes on the train home to, personal ads to all sorts of things were bundled in the newspaper. Today, there's individual apps that fulfill that specific function much better than a newspaper that's printed once a day. And so now you have a news media that's in crisis. The same is happening with our community. More and more things that were bundled up together in one congregation. And for example, if you think of a traditional Catholic parish, not only did it give you your life cycle celebrations, your ritual worship every week, your community, often in part because both Jewish and Catholic communities were not allowed access to mainstream Protestant school and hospitals when waves of immigration were coming into the US. There were Catholic schools, there were Catholic hospitals, there were basically your Catholic community provided everything for your needs. And today, people are living their lives much more unbundled. So we're not going to one institution for all of our needs. We're using the Insight meditation timer, for our meditation. We might go home to celebrate Christmas with our parents, but maybe our partner grew up Hindu, and so we engage in some of those traditional rituals. And so our meaning making and our community lives are more and more becoming remixed to our kind of own personal set of practices and even the language that we use. And so there's a real mismatch between our individual remixed lives and the institutions that were there, that traditionally were there to provide for us. And so there's this real clash between those two, which means that these institutions are in crisis. You mentioned 3,500, and that's a conservative estimate. Churches close every year. 70% of non-Orthodox Jews marry outside the faith. Seminaries are closing. Obviously, in our context, we're looking at religious institutions especially. But also things like the Elks, and the all of those kind of traditional staples of
Freemasons and things like that.
Exactly. They're all declining. And at the same time, you have a kind of a personal crisis where people feel more anxiety, they feel more depressed, they're more isolated, they're more likely to commit suicide, all of the things that we know that are happening on the personal level. And of course, our politics becomes more polarized the fewer relationships that we have. And 1 in 4 Americans now say they have no one that they can turn to for a meaningful conversation, and that includes family members. So we're in this profound crisis of isolation, which I think is an impact of that mismatch between the institutions of community and meaning and our own personal lives.
Gotcha. Okay, so a lot going on here, and you mentioned the 1 in 4, nobody to talk to, and this seems to be part of kind of like larger shifts as you're describing that are also affording new opportunities. So we've got the internet now, we've got all kinds of new ways to foster belonging, and that's creating problems, but it's also creating opportunities. So I guess, what do you see as being where things are going or where they could go from here?
Well, the first thing I would say, Tony, is that the beautiful thing and the assumption that I have is that we humans naturally want to be together. So even though we're in this moment now where there is a disconnect between structure and individual kind of hunger, it doesn't mean that this is how it's going to stay. I think we're in a kind of this classic moment of massive shift in how things are happening, but that desire for connection is as strong as ever. And so we're seeing all sorts of really interesting trends in terms of people often going through an experience and looking for something that might help them with that, not finding it, and then creating their own. So for example, one of the case studies in How We Gather, the report we wrote a few years ago, was the dinner party where Lennon Flowers, who'd lost her mother to cancer in college, a few years later was living in Los Angeles and was kind of tired of that moment where, someone would ask her about her family and she'd say, oh, my mother passed away. And it kind of was this like conversation killer, like people didn't know how to engage with it. So she was like, I just want to have dinner with other people who know what this experience is like. So she got together with 2 friends who'd also lost a parent at a young age. And they just had this amazing dinner where they felt like they could be really authentic, about the sadness they felt, but also the relief or the anger or the, whatever was coming up for them. And so very quickly they started hosting these conversations and it became the dinner party. And very soon there were like 300, 400 tables all around the world who were hosting these kind of conversations. And so we'll often see something like that where someone has that experience, they want to bring people together around it. And then suddenly there's this explosion of interest because we're so hungry for that kind of authentic connection. So we've been looking at over the last 3-4 years, how new communities like the dinner party are kind of springing up to meet the needs that we have that are so inherently human. And some of them are very secular in their expression. It might be fitness communities or maker spaces or co-working spaces like we've talked about. But others are still connected in some way to a religious tradition, even if they look very different. So it might be, not a traditional Jewish congregation, but it might be like an amazing eco farm that brings in Jewish ritual. Or it might be a collection of Muslim friends who start having small groups where they study the text together kind of inverting the traditional or kind of paradigm of authority. So it's this really furtive landscape where all these new efforts are springing up, and often they're remixing in the same way that we talked about before. Like a friend of mine who in Salt Lake City grew up in a Mormon family, really rejected that, traveled to Southeast Asia, like fell in love with Buddhism, was about to become a Buddhist monk, and then was like, wait, I should go back and bring meditation to a Mormon context. And so now he's like melding together Mormon theology and Buddhist meditation practice. So it's those kind of experiments which I just find so captivating.
Yeah, it's what's interesting is that it seems to even be those opportunities are afforded by some of the very things that were driving people apart in the first place. The fact that people can travel now and have these relationships all over the world is now allowing people to find things they wouldn't have found and bring them back home.
100%. And the internet, of course, is the big paradigm shifting technology that we have access to in terms of people finding one another. You know, I think of Scott Heiferman's meetup.com, which is all about, you know, use the internet to get off the internet together. There's so many ways in which to meet other people with shared interests. But I think also the internet, you know, obviously we all know about the challenges of social media. I think one of the big jobs that needs to be done in the landscape right now is helping people remember or find out even who are my people, right? Like what group of 4 or 5 people do I know I can depend on? Because a lot of us now have these wide networks of connections or relationships, but often like who's bringing the birthday cake to the party, right? Like who's the person who's like, I know that I'm Tony's guy, so I'm going to make sure that there's a cake, right? That's often what we're missing. And so if we can help people identify, like, you know, who are my people? Who are the 5 people who I know I can count on? I think that kind of rebundling, right? So we've had this unbundling and remixing, but now what's the way in which we can bring people together into commitment to each other that will help us have that security and that foundation of relationship? I think that's going to be really key.
Yeah, well, and it sounds like a lot of this is just kind of getting the hang of what's possible, recognizing that, hey, maybe we can talk about that thing that has historically been the conversation killer, like talking
Right.
about the grief of loss. And that actually is the best opportunity for a deep bond to be forged, because we don't forge deep, lifelong bonds by just chit-chatting about stuff, right? We got to kind of need a little bit something more.
Yeah, and to enable that to happen is safety, right? Like you want to feel like it's okay to bring a vulnerability or a failing or something that you're struggling with, right? Whether it's maybe you're really struggling with mental health and you're just like so relieved to have an actual conversation about that, or something at work or your marriage, you know, whatever. And so finding ways to kind of create a container, that's the language we often use. Like when do you know you're in the container? When do you know you're out of it? And therefore, this is, for me, also a fun part, is like, what are the rituals that help us know that we're crossing that bridge into the container, right? Like, so if you're going to host a dinner party, like what are the moments when you know it has begun? And what are the moments that you know it's ended? Because we want to live with our hearts on our sleeves in some way, but there are times when it's okay to do that and safe. And there's times when maybe it's a little too risky. So helping people know when they've crossed the boundary into the community and when they're crossing the boundary out again. Those kind of markers, I think, are powerfully helpful to form the strength of that container.
Well, and this is where I think the studying religious institutions comes in handy, because they've been in this business for millennia. And they've got those aspects of it down pat. I mean, maybe to an extreme where those rituals of the entry, ritual and exit, and all of those things are very, very codified. But you're suggesting this in the context of something the opposite of that, which is like a dinner party, right? Something that might not have a label or a website or a brand or a logo. It just could be something very simple.
Totally. And exactly as you say, it can become really big and grand, or it can become like very simple. Like someone, you have, over the last decade or so, there's been the prevalence of like dinner party conversation cards, right? Like trying, and essentially what those cards are trying to do is help us have a different type of conversation. Because if we didn't use them, it would be harder to start with like, but what's really going on, Tony? Or like, what are you really passionate about in life? And we kind of stay at the like, oh, how's work? How's life? Blah, blah, blah. So it's even something like that in itself is a little ritual shift of our dominant culture to go somewhere deeper. So yeah, it can be as simple as it can be as simple as lighting a candle, right? It can be as simple as like, I have some friends who, whenever we're all together for dinner, everyone holds each other's hands and we just go, "It's good to be together. It's good to be together." And it can be just that simple, because then we're like, wait, we're here together. Like, how joyful.
So even just that little moment at the beginning of a dinner to say, "Hey, everybody, we're about to start. Grab the hand of the person on your left or right. And in a second, we're all going to say, it's good to be together. It's good to be together. It's good to be together." And then, wow, you got a little mantra going there too. People are smiling. They're getting a little uncomfortable. They're like loosening up a little bit,
That's when the waiter comes over and asks, "Is everything okay?" Yeah.
And you'll know if you're really in for a good night if you get the waiter in on the meeting as well.
Exactly.
So I really like that you brought up conversation cards, because I feel like it's very easy to, everybody has been to a gathering where there was no facilitated, meaningful interaction.
Yeah.
And so, you end up just kind of staying on the surface level. You meet a bunch of people, you talk about the weather, you talk about sports, and then you go home. And I feel like people kind of come home feeling hollow after that.
Yeah.
But you're talking about something very simple and different.
Yeah. And I mean, conversation cards, it's not like they're the ultimate tool, like a really expert host doesn't even need conversation cards, right? Like you just kind of build that sense of intimacy just by the way everything is set up and the conversation you start. But I think they're a powerful tool. One of the interesting things that we've been tracking is that in traditional religious communities, the thing that would hold people together is orthodoxy, like right belief, that you agree to believe the same things, at least, especially within a Christian paradigm, that's true. But one of the things that we've noticed in a lot of the new communities we've been studying is a real focus on orthopraxy, or right action. And so in these communities, it's not about consenting to the same belief about the world, but it's consenting to a regular practice together. And one of my most favorite examples of that is CrossFit, just because the practice is so intense and so immediately visible. But what holds a lot of new communities together is what they do together rather than what they believe. And so even thinking about how can I design this gathering around a shared activity that can be, adjusted for everyone's capacity and physical needs, etc., but that there's something that holds it together. So, for example, when I got engaged to my now husband, my friend organized a party where we all decorated aprons, which, in itself doesn't sound groundbreaking, but that kind of idea of crafting together, it often facilitates a different kind of conversation, because you don't have the pressure of like looking at each other and having to be, really engaging in deep conversation. You're able to be kind of sitting shoulder to shoulder, whether it's making things, whether it's lifting weights, whether it's running. Like there's a shared activity that kind of holds the relationship in a way that just allows something different to happen. So that's one of the things that I think is interesting when you're trying to gather people. It's like, what's the right practice that can sit at the center of us?
Did you say the word orthopraxy?
Yeah.
So like orthodoxy, but instead of docs, like words or process, exactly. Or it's like practice, the action.
Exactly.
Wow.
And so then you get people being very intense about how you lift the weights, right? Like, because this is how we do it.
So they get a little bit I was going to say orthodoctic.
Yeah, orthopraxic. I don't know. Yeah, exactly.
What I'm finding interesting about this, there's a lot of things I'm interested in, but for one, having a shared practice maybe helps with people who feel a little socially awkward. Absolutely. In a situation where, and I think we haven't talked, or I hope that in the course of this event, we talk about that gathering isn't just for extroverts, that there's a whole, I think most of us identify as introvert. But then like being able to say, like, maybe that's why I gravitate to the kitchen during an event, is that, I don't mind socializing, but I kind of wouldn't mind chopping some vegetables while I'm doing it, just to give me something to do. And maybe us like having that shared activity is actually a natural part of how we bond.
100%. And what you just point to, Tony, is so important, that if you are doing something around a shared activity or a shared practice, people need to know how to join, right? Like if the practice is too difficult to kind of step in and join, you need to create an on-ramp. So again, I'll use CrossFit, right? Before you can join the CrossFit classes, you do a kind of 5 or 6 series of elements classes where you learn the forms. And only once you've learned how to do the various moves with the barbell or the weights are you then able to join the classes themselves. So what's beautiful about a kitchen is that most of us know how to chop an onion, right? And so, or stir a pot. It can be as simple as that, but that's something that we know how to engage with. So thinking about what's the first step for someone who sees the activity, whether it's folding origami or just focusing on our breath and meditation or singing, like what's very traditionally, right? What's the ladder of engagement or the introduction to the practice that people can join? And ideally, if it's something that they already do, what's the place in which they can kind of insert themselves safely and without too much drama and attention being pulled at you if you're an introvert, especially.
Yeah, and I'm thinking now that for somebody who would be looking at this, who maybe has a practice-oriented thing, like maybe they run like a yoga studio or something, right? Where maybe I can add some degree of ritual and onboarding process to kind of bring people in. A lot of places just do classes. There is no get to know your people, get to know your community, that kind of thing. I know a yoga studio I used to go to in Boulder did a sangha, which was kind of like their equivalent of like a social gathering for the members of a yoga studio, because you like see people that you recognize, but you don't have any way to really talk to them that's prescribed. And then maybe on the other end, where you have gatherings that don't involve a shared activity, that you maybe find some way to actually get people out of their seats and doing stuff together.
Yeah. One of the ways that I really like doing that is to give specific roles, because often one of the things, especially when a group is together, there's that sense of like, oh, who's going to do this? Or like, I don't know if I can, and nearly all of us want to be useful in some way. We want to give the gifts that we have. So it's as simple as like, even when you're like clearing a room away saying like, I need 3 volunteers who can help stack chairs. People be like, okay, me. And then they're like, okay, I know how to succeed right now. I'm going to stack chairs, right? So thinking about how can you give people a role, even on a very, very small scale that they can inhabit. Of course, it can be much bigger, right? You're the social coordinator. You're going to coordinate chairs for the next 6 months. It can be much bigger, but it can also be really small. That gives people psychological safety so they know how to contribute to the community. And so having 5 or 6 roles that you hand out essentially at every gathering, timekeeper, make sure the water is always full, whatever it is, those can be real gifts to the people who are starting out, because they start to feel useful and wanted in this community.
People really love feeling helpful. They love feeling useful. They love, like, if someone asks for help, hey, you can help me with this. Really? I can help. Great. Yes. And I'll say also from my own experience, having run so many events at my space, it solves a practical concern as well.
Exactly.
It's just when you're setting up and somebody shows up early and you're not quite ready, that person's like trying to talk to you and you're like still like stacking chairs or whatever. And you're like, hey,
exactly.
Why don't you help me out?
Exactly. And that's also when we know we really belong to a community. My colleague Sue tells the story of when she knew that she belonged to a congregation that she joined was the moment when the toilet paper had run out in the ladies' bathroom. And she was like, not only do I notice this, but B, I think I know where the toilet roll is kept. And C, let me go and get that toilet roll and replace this one. Like, those are the moments when we're like, oh, I belong here. And that's a powerful tool. You want as many people to feel that. So literally giving them responsibilities is a kind of shortcut in that direction.
Totally. And I like that you said, I belong here. Like, that's the moment when somebody says they belong here is when they replace the toilet paper. And it's so simple. It's so beautiful. Okay. So let's talk about where all this is going. We're seeing all this cool stuff happening and it's exciting.
Yeah.
And I'm imagining it's too early to really be able to wrap our arms around it. But can you try to do it anyway? Can you give me a sense of like, what's gonna, when we have like Gathering Summit X 10 years from now, and we talk about how we saved the world through gathering, how did that happen? Like, did this work? Like, why did it work? Were we able to turn all these trends around? That's a big question, but I think you can.
Well, I'm very hopeful. I think some of the trends that we're seeing is a lot of new communities get built because someone has the vision and the passion and the skill to build something. And they're often, maybe more charismatic or just like really driven. There's something about them that won't let this go. And they create something beautiful. what often happens is within 2 to 5 years, there's kind of a burnout moment. And we have seen, even in the few years that we've been doing this, that there's a kind of like, a new community arises, it has its moment. And then unless there's been a leadership kind of capacity development, it can crash and burn because it's so built around one person. So one of the things that I'm always really passionate about is recommending to people that they don't do this work alone. So that if you're creating something, find collaborators, find people who will be, maybe there'll be no one who's like as in it as you are, but who will take responsibility and who will also be rewarded then for kind of building up that ecology of leadership that you really need for a community to be sustained. So that's what one of the first things I think is really important, is to think about. Don't do this work alone. There's all sorts of technical challenges, right? Like what's are you registered as a 501c3? How do you do the taxes and like HR, and like what happens, when crises hit, like someone's accused of sexual assault in the community, like all of these kind of things that happen in, congregations or other existing communities are going to happen in these newer ones too. So one of the big things, as well as kind of finding collaborators kind of horizontally, is finding mentors and elders and advisors who have done this work before. And one of the big things that we've invested in is trying to kind of help younger community leaders connect with elders. And for us, that's a little different from a coach, and even a little different from a mentor, because in kind of thinking about a lineage of ancestry, like people have gathered forever. That's just an innate human capacity and a human desire. And so we try and look for someone who can offer, in our language, we use benevolent witnessing. So someone who's a loving presence, who's there to ask questions, and certainly to answer them if you have them. But they're really there just to show up maybe once a month in a phone call and say, like, how are you, Tony? Like, how are you doing? Yes, I care about the project and I want it to succeed, but I know that the success of the project is directly related to you and your well-being and your sense of connection to purpose. And to have someone who literally maybe if they're a religious person, they might even pray for you. I have a nun who I meet with semi-regularly, and I know that she prays for me, which is an unusual experience for me, but it feels wonderful to know that there's someone who's really invested in me in that way. And so going out and maybe it's drawing on a relationship you already have, someone older who you respect. And it's not even about their skill set, it's about their way of being in the world. That's what we end up talking a lot about. So thinking about those intergenerational relationships of support and witness, in our experience, is often the difference between someone kind of crashing and burning or someone making it through a dip and coming out the other side. So those kind of relationships, I think, are going to be central to whatever comes next.
I'm so familiar with the language of a mentor, and I feel like everybody should have the mentor role in their life. But yes, now I kind of want an elder. I kind of want to meet an elder. That sounds like so much cooler,
But both are valuable. Both are super. A mentor, in my mind, is a bit more technical. Maybe they're really good at the thing you're learning how to do, which is super helpful. And a coach is there to kind of hold you accountable and to kind of keep you on track to the plans you've made. But yeah, there is something different about the kind of the loving embrace of a grandmother.
Yeah. I guess the person in the elder role is kind of thinking in much longer terms than your particular project or even your career path, where they're maybe trying to guide you on your path in your life, regardless of kind of the twists and turns that it takes.
That's right. That's a beautiful way of saying it. Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah. So we're seeing more of those kind of connections happening, and I'm really excited again about the kind of all the new ideas and new ways of gathering that are emerging. Whether it's one of the things I'm curious about, and I still have mixed feelings about, is how community and even spirituality in terms of wellness and spiritual practice like meditation is showing up within a workplace. The more that people are spending time at work and the work is their center of their purpose and their meaning-making lives, to what extent can there really be authentic community that lives in a workplace where you have real differences of hierarchy? So that'll be interesting to track and see in 10 years' time if that turns out to be a winning success.
It sounds like a good thing at first, where you say, well, sure, we want more community, we want more connectedness, but when it's mandated by management, you kind of
it feels different. Yeah.
Okay, and in terms of case studies, you've got a fair number that you've seen through your studies. Are there any that stand out as particularly exciting or informative that people watching this should go check out and maybe learn a lot from if they were able to kind of read their stories?
Yeah, definitely. Well, a good collection will be just the reports that we've written. So if you go to howwegather.org, you can download the reports. The first one is often the place where people start, How We Gather. The communities that I get really excited about are ones that shift dominant culture in some way. So I think of there's a wonderful makerspace just a few miles behind me in Somerville, Massachusetts, called Artisans Asylum. And it's a big makerspace, and it's, I think, got nearly 100 kind of little workshops in the space. Everything from jewelry making to woodwork to like laser cutting machinery to everything you can imagine in the kind of creative world. And what's so beautiful is that this community also kind of celebrates moments in the calendar together. So they host a Maker's Giving around Thanksgiving every year, where people not only kind of bring potluck meals to celebrate together, but they also bring an item that they've created. And so you get this incredible table of all these fantastical creations and collaborations. And the thing that they shift, I think, in dominant culture is that we live in a consumer mindset, right? What can I get for the price that I pay? And the folks at Artisans Asylum have a very collaborative mindset, in the sense that if someone, one story of a mother who wanted to make a kind of flashing lights costume for her daughter for Halloween, was like, I've never done any of this. I don't know how to work with these LED lights. Can someone help me? Kind of on their message board. And within a few hours, all the materials that she needed had been delivered to her door. Someone was going to show her all the technical stuff, and someone else was, going to help sew it all together. And so just that community of generosity and that kind of gift economy approach of trust and the firm belief that if I help you, someone is going to help me, and that we don't necessarily need money or even some way of kind of making that happen. And so I think I read this fascinating article recently that talked about how we lost our culture of hospitality, and it pointed to a monastery in the 13th century that built a little these monks lived together, and if someone came to the town and needed a place to stay, the villagers would just take the stranger in, because where else are you going to sleep? But then as the monks became more formalized, they didn't have as much capacity to welcome friends in themselves. And so they built this little kind of hostel. And so now when someone came to the village and said, I need a place to stay, the villagers would be like, go to the hostel, rather than welcoming people into their own homes. And so, whether we're thinking about the opioid crisis or people who are homeless or all the social ills that we live with, it's not in any way about the lack that those individuals have somehow. I think it's about a culture of me firstness that has kind of poisoned our capacity to welcome people into our lives and into our homes. And so anything that counters that and creates welcome and creates it really puts love at the center of the community, that for me is an inspiring story. So little stories like the Artisans Asylum for me kind of point to that in some way, which is so cool.
Yeah, well, and what a name too. You told me before we started recording about your book that you're researching for, which comes out 2020 sometime.
That's the hope.
And so I was tempted to ask you, what's something really modern and recent that you're excited about? But I know in that book you're researching kind of ancient practices. Yeah. So maybe I'll flip it for you and say, what's some really old thing that you recently learned about that you're excited about?
Yeah, 100%. It's funny. We were in a meeting recently with a tech company, and they were talking about their kind of, their engineers and the technology they were working with. And they pointed to myself and Sue and Angie, my colleagues, and they were like, you guys are ancient technologists. And I was like, whoa, that's so cool, right? Like the ancient technologies of gathering and becoming. So one technology I'm really interested in, one of these ancient technologies, is the practice of covenant, which, is really about, if strategy is helping us know what are we going to do together, covenant is really an acknowledgement of how we're going to be together. And this I really learned from my colleague Sue. And it's, it's a practice whereby you might spend a couple of days with your team really saying, how do we want to be, and writing that down and putting it into some beautiful language. And we do this every week now, that at the beginning of our team meeting, we read out loud that covenant. kind of paragraph by paragraph. It's about a page. And it says, things like what we'll do if we end up in a conflict with one another or someone wants to leave the collaboration. It talks about the hope we have for balance and the ways in which we'll help each other find balance, knowing it'll be different for each of us. All of this kind of stuff. And what's beautiful is I recently learned that in a Jewish context, the kind of the marriage certificate, which is the ketubah, where you have usually a beautiful written kind of piece of art nearly, which has the marriage vows, and couples will hang it on the wall. There's a tradition of taking that down every anniversary and reading it out loud again to one another. And it just reminded me, for so many communities that new people join and old people leave, like, how do you constantly recenter the things that we all wanted when we arrived? And so just that practice of returning to purpose, returning to mission, or returning to the way in which we want to be in relationship by, taking it off the wall or reading it aloud at a team meeting. That for me has just become really resonant as a practice. Yeah,
that's great. Now I want a covenant. I want a personal one. I want one for my business.
It's awesome. It is
great. All right, so lightning round. We're at the end here.
Okay.
Just really quick, books. So I know you happen to have a shelf full of them. What are some books we might not have heard of? There are some that we've pretty much all heard of by now.
Yes.
Ones that you'd recommend.
Well, there's two, and they're both religious, so forgive me, but I find it very helpful if you can translate a little bit of the theology to whatever language resonates for you. One that I think is just so insightful is Community and Growth by Jean Vanier. He was the founder of the L'Arche movement, which is this incredible network of communities of people with disabilities and without who live together. And his whole framework of thinking about human relationship and community is by looking at people who are often most marginalized, people with disabilities, and the way in which they often have the most honest and open-hearted connection to one another. And the ways in which we, as people perhaps without disabilities, come into those communities wanting to help, and then end up actually being transformed ourselves. And so it's a very Christian book, but I think it speaks the most powerfully about that connection between relationship and growth. So Community and Growth by Jean Vanier is one. And then one for history nerds, and I just need to look up, I can't remember the exact author, but it's about the beginning of the Methodist movement in England. And it is fascinating. The book is called Wesley and His Methodists. And especially if you're interested in using small groups, to look at how John Wesley started getting together a small group of kind of fellow religious radicals, really, who wanted to make a real change in the way that they lived their lives and the ways that they wanted to serve society. If you know people who maybe in their bedroom have kind of a whiteboard in which they tick off, did I exercise today? Did I meditate today? Did I complete my to-do list? He was doing that with, did I visit someone in prison? Did I give money to the poor? Did I pray? And from that kind of rigor, which is why Methodists are called Methodists, because he had this really strong method. From that rigor came this really kind of renewing movement in the UK and in the US, which was really built a lot on small groups. So much so that you couldn't attend Sunday worship if you hadn't attended your small group meeting that week. So it's just a fascinating kind of historical case study of small groups within a larger community.
Wow, neat. Okay, I got Wesley and the People Called Methodists by Richard P. Heitzenrater.
That's the one. It's neat. Pretty dry historical stuff, but just look for the small group chapters.
All right, last thing, a message of encouragement to those of us watching, people organizing, people thinking of starting a community, people who are maybe been running one for a while, they're getting burned out, they want to revitalize, they want to get inspired. What's your message to the people who are watching this right now?
Mostly it's a message of gratitude. I really think at this point in the world, anyone who contributes by building community, by bringing people into meaningful relationship, in my perspective, I think it's holy work. And I'm very grateful for all the hard work and frankly, the invisible labor that often happens that no one recognizes. These are the people who know and who get it. So talk to each other here. Continue as you can. I think it's one of the most important things we can be doing as humans today.
Thanks, Casper. It's been such a pleasure. Appreciate you taking the time, and we'll talk more soon, I'm sure.
My pleasure, Tony. And thanks to everyone for listening. I hope you have a wonderful day.
All right. Bye.